I don't think this would be possible without her. Literally, like, at 22 years old, she gave birth to a really sick child and became, in that moment, my biggest advocate. Physical therapy in schools, access to elevators, schools with elevators, access to speech therapy, taking me to the hospital for orthopedic care, getting me a surgeon who's going to do the best work possible to help me improve my mobility. And so while my mother is imperfect in her love for me, she kept loving me. And while my mother still doesn't exactly understand what I do, even though she has seen me do it at universities and different schools around New Jersey, she still can't wrap her head around it, because in her life, this isn't a career path. This is, she doesn't get it. This is something you do on the side, not actual career, right? And so she doesn't get that. But I came out to her a text message, and then I came out to her as gender nonconforming in college, and it took me a long time to set boundaries with my mother. I spent the first 4 years of therapy in college talking about how much I hated my mother. And I share that because, and I also have a new podcast called the Ma and Me podcast. Oh, this has wheels, okay, noted. The Ma and Me podcast, which is about a podcast co-hosted with my friend Crystal, a 50-something-year-old black woman from the South whose mother is an addict, and my mother in her 50s as well, Latina, severe mental illness, right? And we call it the Ma and Me podcast because we're talking about how we're mothering ourselves into wholehearted people, how we're addressing our mother wound and the wounds of our family. And so it's available on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and I definitely encourage you to search it. It's Ma, M-A, and the word, Me, podcast. And I share really difficult stories on that podcast about my mother and I's relationship. And most recently, what we love about our mothers was the latest episode. I share some of the positive things. My mother has the gift for gab. My mother did not go into a room where she didn't think she had a friend, right? My mother was just she had two sides to her, the ratchet side and the, hi, I want to help everyone, right? She's very giving in that way. Shout out to the Puerto Rican mothers in the room and those watching. And so I came out to her that way, and it was really difficult. And what freed me from my hatred of my mother was when my feminist thought allowed me to recognize her first as a woman, and then my mother. Before my mom was a teen mom, before my mom was my mom, she was a young woman trying to navigate a world that was not kind to brown women, who spoke too loud, who was willing to fight, and it's everyone and everyone. Right? My mom was a fighter, right? And while I have the privilege of living out my dreams, I know that came at the expense of my mother's dreams. About a year or 2 years ago, we had an argument, which is pretty common, not so much now, because boundaries. Boundaries is a distance in which I can love you while still loving myself. That's what I've learned over the last 13 years in therapy. So for the children in the room with parents who don't know boundaries, teach them by enforcing them and not bucking under the pressure of cultural expectations. Okay, that aside, I really recognized, I had a conversation with an argument with her 2 years ago, and I said to her, and my mom is never one to be lost for words, but her silence this time was deafening because she's never lost for words. But I said to her in the middle of an argument, who did you want to become before life happened to you? Before trauma, not just deferred your dreams, but denied you of your dreams. She just started bawling her eyes out. So for those of you who are struggling with your parents right now, I want you to give them grace. I want you to understand that before they were your parent, they were a person trying to learn how to love themselves in a world that told them they were not lovable. Thank you. Do we have time for one more question or no? One more question. One more question.
Does anyone else
all the way in
have
the
a
back.
question?
Can you come down here? Great. Can I take the mic, Lisette, since this is the last